a smoke-filled back room above a numbers bank on 133rd Street. They had already decided the outcome before the meeting started. Bumpy Johnson was finished. Ed, that was the agreement, spoken quietly, nodded through clenched jaws. Between the men sitting at the long scarred table, 3 Harlem operators, 2 Italian fixers, 1 lawyer who never two. Okay notes. The reason was simple and ugly. Bumpy had been away too long, and while he was gone, money changed hands without him. The man who started it was Calvin Moore. Calvin wasn't a boss. He was a collector, a careful one. The kind who paid hospital bills on time and never missed rent for his mother on Lenox Avenue. But 2 weeks earlier, Calvin had skimmed from a heroin delivery just enough to cover his brother's dialysis. He planned to replace it before anyone noticed. Bumpy noticed. Not because of the missing cash, because the shipment arrived late, because Sam, Aeon had panicked and rushed the count, because mistakes like that got people killed, so Calvin did the only thing fear allows. He chose survival over loyalty. He told the Italians that Bump was weak now. He told the Harlem men that Bumpy was planning to cut them out. And he told himself that if Bumpy didn't show up tonight, the problem would solve itself. The door was still closed. Someone laughed. Not loudly, just enough to test the room. The lawyer cleared his throat. We moved forward, no delays. That's when the shouting started downstairs. Not yelling, order sharp, controlled. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming up the stairs. Calvin's hand slid under the table, his fingers touched cold metal. He wasn't sure if he was shaking or if the building was. The door opened. Bumpy Johnson walked in. No entourage, no jacket, just a dark suit and eyes that scanned the room like he was counting exits instead of faces. No one stood. That was the insult. Bumpy looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, the one they'd already reassigned. He pulled it out himself and sat down. I hear I'm late, he said. That's my fault. Silence. One of the Italians reached for a cigarette and stopped halfway. Unsure, Bumpy turned his head slow toward Calvin. Calv, he said, you look tired. Calvin swallowed. Long week. Yeah, Bumpy said. Long weeks make men sloppy. The lawyer tried to speak. This meeting was called to. Bumpy raised one finger, not loud, not angry. Before anything gets said, he continued, I want something returned. He nodded toward the table. A paper bag was pushed forward by one of Bumpy's men, someone no one remembered entering. Inside was the missing cash, every dollar. Calvin's stomach dropped. Bumpy, lean closer. You took it to save your brother, he said. I know. I paid his bill yesterday. Calvin looked up, confused. Relief flashing for half a second. Then Bumpy added, but you also told them I was finished. The room shifted. Chairs scraped. A gun clicked somewhere to the left. Bumpy didn't move. He just asked one question enough to feel dangerous. Which one of you decide? I wasn't walking out of here alive. Calvin Moore had learned early that fear didn't arrive loud. It crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. His brother, Edmore, was 32 and dying in pieces, kidney failure first, then infections, then the bills. Every week, the hospital added a new number to a ledger Calvin could never quite erase. Their mother prayed. Dr. S avoided eye contact, and Calvin did what he'd always done. He counted money and moved it where it needed to go until it wasn't enough. The skim wasn't greed. It wasn't ambition. It was desperation with a clock attached. Calvin had told himself it would be temporary, just to hold over until the next run. But the problem with temporary decisions in Harlem was that they tended to become permanent mistakes, especially when the men at the top had survived prisons, wars, and enemies who were better armed than Calvin would ever be. Bumpy Johnson didn't miss numbers. He missed patterns, Cav, and knew that the night Bumpy's message came. Not a threat, not a warning, just a request to meet. That was worse. Bumpy never chased men. If he asked for a meeting, it meant he already had answers, so Calvin went looking for another one. The Italians were cautious but curious. They had never trusted Bumpy, not fully. Respect, yes. Partnership, sure, but control, never. Calvin fed tea, hemmed out in careful pieces. He said Bumpy was sick. He said Bumpy was distracted. He said Bumpy was losing grip on Harlem streets. Most importantly, he said Bumpy would forgive him. He's sentimental. Calvin told them to loyal to punish his own. The lead tasted bitter even as he spoke it. By the time the meeting was scheduled, Calvin had convinced himself of something else, too. If Bumpy didn't walk into that room, the city would keep moving. Money always did. Ed might live. Calvin might survive. He just hadn't planned on Bumpy paying the hospital bill. Now sitting across from Calvin felt the ground tilt. Bumpy's voice wasn't raised. That made it worse. You didn't ask, Bumpy said. You took. Calvin forced himself to speak. I was going to replace it. You didn't. I would have. Bumpy leaned back. You didn't. The Italians watched carefully. This wasn't their argument yet. They were waiting to see if blood would settle it for them. Calvin's aim raced. If Bumpy killed him here, Eddie would die within weeks. If he begged, he'd be dead before the words finished leaving his mouth. The only card left was truth. And Truth Washington. "S dangerous. My brother needed treatment," Calvin said. I chose him. Bumpy nodded once. That part one understand. Hope flickered again. But then you chose them. Bumpy continued, I shifting briefly to the Italians, and that choice carries interest. A chair scraped. One of the Harlem men stood hand near his coat. The tension snapped tighter like wire pulled too far. The lawyer finally spoke. Thi. S doesn't need to turn violent. Bumpy smiled. Without warmth. It already did. Just not in the way you're thinking. He turned back to Calvin. I paid Eddie's bill because I wanted you clear. He aided when you decided what came next. Calvin frowned. What decision? Bumpy leaned forward, lowering his voice. You tell me who set the contingency. Not the talk, the backup. Calvin's hard hammered. I don't. Who told you I wouldn't show? Bumpy cut in. Who promised you protection after I was gone? The Italians stiffened. Calvin realized then that this meeting hadn't been called to negotiate. It had been called to test him, and failing meant more than his own life. If he spoke, Ed lived, but the city burned around him. If he stayed silent, Bumpy would make an example that no hospital Bill couldn't do. Bumpy waited. The room waited. And Calvin understood finally that survival had already demanded a price he wasn't sure he could pay. So the question hung there, heavy and unavoidable. Who was Calvin more willing to sacrifice to keep his brother alive? Calvin Moore had always believed there were only two kinds of men in Harlem. The ones who talked too much and the ones who didn't live long enough to talk at all. Bumpy Johnson was neither. Bumpy waited. That silence did more damage than shouting ever could. It gave Calvin time to picture Ed in a hospital bed, skin turning gray, breath shallow. It gave him time to imagine his mother sitting alone in a dark apartment, listening for footsteps that would never come. And it gave the men around the table time to calculate. One of the Italians, Vincenzo Romano, leaned back in his chair, hands open, harmless. Let's not pretend this is simple, he said calmly. Nobody here wanted a mess. Bumpy didn't look at him. Then somebody shouldn't have planned one. Vincenzo smiled thinly. Plans are just insurance. That word landed hard. Insurance meant expectation, backup meant intent. Calvin felt sway. I gather at his collar. He realized something else then, something cooler than fear. They hadn't been waiting to see if Bumpy survived the meeting. They'd been waiting to see how he died. The gun under the table felt heavier now. Useless. A child's toy in a room full of men who thought 3 steps ahead. Bumpy turned back to Calvin. You already crossed one line. He said, I didn't kill you for it. That buys you one honest answer. Calvin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The Harlem men shifted again. One of them, Leon Graves, younger and impatient, snapped, "This is dry." Aang, Bumpy's eyes flicked to Leon. "Sit." Leon froze then sat. Calvin finally spoke. "If I tell you," he said, "there's no going back." Bumpy nodded. "That's usually how truth works." Calvin swallowed. "They told me you'd been boxed in, that the Italians had cover, that tonight was cleanup." Vincenzo exhaled slowly. "Careful, Cal." Bumpy raised a hand toward Vincenzo without looking at him. "You'll speak when I ask." The room went quiet. Again, Calvin continued, voice shaking now. "They said if you showed, you'd be outnumbered, and if you didn't, the streets would move on." Bumpy tilted his head. "Who said it?" Calvin hesitated. That hesitation was the real betrayal. Bumpy stood up. The chair scraped loudly, echoing like a gunshot. Several hands moved toward weapons. Bumpy didn't. He acknowledged them. He walked behind Calvin, close enough that Calvin could smell his cologne. Faint, but deliberate. "You already made the choice," Bumpy said quietly near his ear. "You're just slow admitting it." Calvin felt his throat tighten. It was Vincenzo. The room exploded in motion. Vincenzo stood instantly shouting in Italian. One of the Harlem men drew his gun. Another BL. Off the door, the lawyer ducked under the table. Bumpy's hand came down hard on Calvin's shoulder, forcing him back into his seat. "Not him alone," Bumpy said sharply. "Who else?" "Calvin." Eyes darted around the room. Leon Graves wouldn't meet his gaze. That was enough. Bumpy turned. "Leon." Leon stood furious. "This is nonsense." Bumpy's voice hardened. "You were promised the east side." Leon's face drained of color. "That's what I thought." Bumpy said. The Italian shouted again. Vincenzo backed toward the wall. "This was never supposed to go like this." Bumpy nodded once. "It need, or does for the man who thinks he's ahead." He turned back to Calvin. "You had two choices tonight. Protect your brother or protect the lie." Calvin's chest heaved. "I didn't want this." Bumpy's eyes softened for just a second. "Nobody does." Then Bumpy stepped away. That's when the lights went out. Total darkness. A gun fired. Wild, panic, glass shattered. Someone screamed, and in that chaos, a realization cut through Calvin's. Terror, like ice. This blackout wasn't a mistake. It was planned. And whatever Bumpy had set in motion, it was already too late to stop. So, who had prepared for the darkness, and who had been walking straight into it blind. The darkness lasted 3 seconds. That was all. But in those 3 seconds, plans collapsed. Loyalties exposed themselves, and D-men learned whether they were hunters or targets. The first gunshot came from the wrong side of the room. Not from Bumpy's direction, not from the Italians. It came from behind the lawyer's chair. That was the first clue. The second was that Bumpy didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly on the back of Calvin's chair, as if the blackout were nothing. More than an inconvenience. Then the lights snapped back on, and the room looked different. 2 men were on the floor, one clutching his leg, bleeding badly, the other unconscious, face smashed at. Against the table's edge, the lawyer was frozen under the table, hands over his head, whispering prayers he didn't believe in. Leon Graves was gone. The door at the back of the room, normally kept locked, hung open. Bumpy finally moved. He stepped forward and reached down, calmly, picking up a revolver that hadn't been there before. He checked the cylinder, nodded once, and handed it to one of his men. "Secure the stairs," he said. Vincenzo Romano was breathing hard now. His jacket was open. His hands were raised, but his eyes weren't pleading. They were calculating. "You planned this." Vincenzo's aide. Bumpy turned to him. "No," he replied. "I expected this." Calvin's ears rang. What just happened?" Bumpy looked down at him. "You told him I wouldn't show." "They planned To finish the job without witnesses, Vincenzo shook his head. That's not. Bumpy cut him off. The blackout wasn't for me. It was for Leon. Silence swallowed the room. Calvin's stomach twisted. Leon, Bumpy, nodded. Leon was the trigger man, always was. Vincenzo's face hardened. You're guessing. Bumpy smiled faintly. No, I am confirming. He turned to Calvin. When the lights went out, Leon ran. Not because he was scared, but because he thought the shot already landed. Calvin stared. The shot. Bumpy gestured toward the unconscious man on the floor. That wasn't panic fire. That was a miss. Leon aimed where I was supposed to be standing. Calvin's chest tightened. But you weren't there. Exactly. The twist settled in like a slow poison. Bumpy had never planned to sit in that chair. He had let them believe he would. Vincenzo laughed bitterly. So this was theater. Bumpy shook his head. This was insurance. He walked closer to Vincenzo. You and Lane didn't plan to negotiate. You planned to remove me and split the roots. Vincenzo's jaw clenched. And if you were wrong, Bumpy's voice dropped. Then I'd be dead. That landed hard. Calvin finally understood the truth though. T had been circling him all night. This meeting wasn't called to save Bumpy. It was called to identify who wanted him buried. The blackout, the empty chair, the missing shooter, it all pointed one direction. Bumpy turned to one of his men. Finally, the man nodded and left. Vincenzo spread his hands. Even if Lane planned it, that doesn't mean I sanctioned. Bumpy stepped in close. You didn't stop it. Vincenzo's eyes flicked away. Just for a moment, that was enough. Bumpy straightened and addressed the room. Here's what's going to happen, he said evenly. Leon runs. He thinks. He's free, Calvin whispered. Is he? Bumpy looked at him. No, he turned back to Vincenzo. You'll return every dollar you touched. Every corner you leaned on, though, you'll do it, Q. Fitly, Vincenzo scoffed. And if I don't, Bumpy's gaze hardened, then Eddie's doctor will start missing payments. Calvin jolted. What? Bumpy didn't look at him. I paid the bill. I didn't promise a future. Calvin's face drained of color. You said I wanted you clear-headed. Bumpy replied, not comfortable. The weight of it crushed him. Bumpy had saved Eddie's life just long ago. GH to use it as leverage. Vincenzo finally understood, too. You're punishing him. Bumpy shook his head. No, I'm reminding him what choices cost. A shout echoed from downstairs, footsteps fast. The door burst open. Bumpy's man returned. Breathless, Leon's car was waiting in the alley, engine warm. Bumpy nodded. Where is he? The man hesitated. He didn't make it to the car. Cav. In's heart pounded. What does that mean? The man swallowed. He ran into traffic. Truck didn't stop. The room fell silent again. Leon Graves was dead. Not by Bumpy's hand. Not by a bull. By momentum. By panic. By trying to outrun a plan already closed around him. Bumpy looked down at Calvin. That's what happens when you move before you know the whole map. Calvin stared at the floor, shaking because now he saw it clearly. Bumpy Johnson hadn't walked into a trap. He had walked into a room where every outcome already favored him except one, and that exception was Stan. Standing right in front of him, Bumpy leaned closer and asked quietly, Now tell me, Cal, do you still want to survive this? The room smelled like sweat and gunpowder long after the noise stopped. Calvin Moore couldn't feel his hands. Leon Graves was dead, not arrested, not negotiated with, gone. And everyone in the room understood the message that came with it. Panic killed faster than bullets. Bumpy Johnson sat back down, finally taking the chair they tried to give away. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. Vincenzo Romano adjusted his jacket slowly, as if any sudden move might still get him killed. You've made your point, he said. This didn't have to end like this. Bumpy glanced at him. It didn't end. Corrected. Vincenzo exhaled sharply. And the terms, you Already heard them. Bumpy said, "You return what you took. You stop pressing corners that aren't yours. And you forget you ever thought I was absent." Vincenzo nodded once. He knew better than to bargain now. The price of resistance had been demonstrated. Clearly enough, Bumpy turned to Calvin. This was the part Calvin had been dreading. "You saved your brother's life," Bumpy said. "That counts." Calvin looked up, eyes wet. "Then let him live." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "That depends on you." The words landed like a verdict. "You don't work collections anymore," Bumpy continued. "You're done touching money," Calvin blinked. "Then what do I do?" Bumpy leaned forward. "You watch," Calvin frowned. "Watch what people?" Bumpy replied. "You sit where you are, you listen, you report." Calvin's stomach tightened. "You're making me AA." "Mirror," Bumpy cut in. "You'll show me who's getting nervous before they decide to be brave." Calvin understood the trap immediately. If he failed, D would die. If he succeeded, he lived. Knowing every word he spoke might end someone else. There was no clean exit. Vincenzo cleared his throat. "And if Calvin decides he's had enough, Bumpy looked at him. "Then his brother's doctor will stop answering the phone." Calvin closed his eyes. The cost of survival was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a hospital bed, a ticking clock. Bumpy stood, signaling the meeting's end. Men gathered their coats. No one lingered. No one made eye contact. The balance in the room had shifted, not loudly, but permanently, as they filed. D out. Calvin stayed seated. Bumpy paused at the door. "One more thing." Calvin looked up. "You weren't wrong to choose family," Bumpy said. "You were wrong to think you could do it alone." Then he left. The door closed behind him. Calvin sat there, surrounded by overturned chairs and blood-stained floorboards, understanding the full consequence of his choice. Leon was dead. Vincenzo was trapped. And Cal then was alive but which raised the only question that mattered now. How long could a man live when every breath belonged to someone else? By morning, Harlem already knew something had shifted, not because of headlines, not because of sirens, because men who usually talk too much suddenly didn't talk at all. Corners went quiet. Deliveries arrived on time. Arguments that should have escalated simply stopped. It was the kind of calm that followed a storm no one admitted witnessing. Leon Graves's name wasn't spoken. That absence said more than any funeral ever could. Calvin Moore noticed it first from the inside. People looked at him differently now, not with respect, with caution, as if he carried bad weather in his pocket. His phone rang instantaneously. Why, old associates checking in, new ones pretending. Coincidence, everyone wanting to know the same thing without asking it outright. Was it true? Calvin answered none of them, because the truth was worse. Then rumor. Eddie's treatments continued. The hospital bills were paid on time every time. Nurses smiled again. Doctors explained procedures instead of rushing through them. Ed even joked once about getting out by summer. Each laugh felt like borrowed time. Bumpy Johnson didn't appear in public for days. That worried people more than if he had. When he finally did, walking calmly into a barber shop on 125th Street, conversations died mid-sentence. No speech, no announcement, just presence. Vincenzo Romano sent word through intermediaries. The money was returned. The royalties were relinquished. His men pulled back, without protest. He didn't test boundaries again. The message was clear. The meeting had consequences beyond the room. Calvin met Bumpy only once more. That week, no guards, no guns visible. Bumpy poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. "You're doing fine," he said. Calvin stared into the cup. "I don't sleep." Bumpy nodded. "Good means you're paying attention." Calvin's voice shook. "Leon didn't have to die." Bumpy looked at him evenly. "Leon decided to run. That was your plan." "No," Bumpy said quietly. "My plan was to let him choose." Calvin looked up. "You knew he would." Bumpy didn't answer. That silence was heavier than any confession. As days passed, a new order settled in. Not louder, not bloodier, but tighter. Men double-checked decisions. Favors were repaid promptly. Nobody assumed absences meant weakness anymore. Calvin watched it all from his assigned seat. He had become what Bumpy promised. Ed, a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. Because every improvement came with a cost. Fear worked. It always had. But it left scars that didn't show on the street. One evening, as Calvin sat alone in his apartment, the phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. A calm voice said, "You don't know me, but I know what happened upstairs." Calvin froze. The voice continued, "And I think you're the man who can help me survive it." The line went dead. Calvin stared at the phone, realizing the aftershock hadn't finished rippling outward, because now others were watching him, and the role he'd been forced into was spreading, which left one dangerous question hanging in the air. How long before Calvin became the very thing he feared most? 3 months later, Ed and Moore walked out of the hospital, thinner, weaker, alive. Calvin stood beside him in the sunlight, smiling for their mother, nodding at the doctor, saying all the right words. No one noticed. See the way his hand shook when he lit a cigarette. Outside, no one asked who had paid for the last round of treatment. They didn't need to. That night, Calvin sat alone at his kitchen table, one face down. He hadn't called anyone in weeks. He didn't need to. People came to him now, carefully, indirectly, like men approaching a quiet dog they weren't sure would bite. The phone buzzed. Said, a message from an unknown number, meeting tomorrow. Same building, upstairs. Calvin closed his eyes. He understood the irony at last. They thought Bumpy Johnson was finished. Then he walked in. Now they thought Calvin Moore was harmless because he stayed seated. He went to the window and looked down at the street. Cars passed. Music drifted. Life continued, unaware of the weight it rested on. Bumpy had given him survival, but survival came with a shape. It looked like an empty chair at the head of a table. It sounded like silence when men waited for you to speak first. It felt late. Choosing who lived by choosing who didn't. Calvin picked up the phone and typed one word in response. Understood. Outside, the city didn't change. Inside, a man did, and the cost of that change would never show up on a hospital bill. If you want the next story where survival demands a price no one sees coming, subscribe and stay close. Because the most dangerous men don't walk in anymore, they wait.